Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave, and we are the IB English guys. And today, this is the third video of our series where we're looking at prose fiction, how to read a prose fiction passage. Today, we're excited because we're going to look at a piece of writing analysis of a passage we did with about our previous passage that we talked about. So today we are going to we're going to review our protocol. We're going to look at the SCASNI protocol. We're going to summarize the passage that we talked about in the previous video. We're going to examine rubric terms and talk about that. Then we're going to look at the student's thesis and his outline. And finally, we're going to take a look at several paragraphs of this great piece of writing.
Mr. Giles, that sounds like a pretty ambitious plan.
We're going to do it.
We better get cracking.
Let's
okay?
do it.
All right, so just a quick review of the acronym from our last video. Of course, it is SCASNI. Sea Coral. Help me out, Giles.
Sea coral always sits near islands.
Sea coral always sits near islands. SCASNI. Okay, thank you. The S stands for setting. The C for characters. The A is for the actions. The second S is for style. The N is for narrative point of view. And of course, the I, it all leads to those ideas.
Fantastic. So again, this is a great way to analyze a prose fiction passage. The passage that we discussed in the previous video is from A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki that was published in 2013. This passage is about a lost cat in this very rural setting. There's a forest full of predators, there's a storm outside, and we see Oliver going to look for the cat, and Ruth is really torn up because she feels like she had an argument with Oliver and that caused Pesto to leave.
Not Pesto.
Pesto left, and then Oliver comes back empty-handed, and she has a conversation with a crow. And it's a very exciting passage, and this is what it's about.
Okay, folks, before we get into more depth, I just want to briefly mention the rubric criteria, and we can talk about some of the aspects that we want our writers to feature in their work, okay? Of course, criterion A is your understanding and interpretation, and this is where, as a student, you want to really pull out some really strong textual references from the text, and you want to make sure that you offer a convincing and insightful interpretation of the larger implications and subtleties of the text.
That's great. Implications. We like that word, implications. The criteria B is interpretation and evaluation. This, again, we're looking for that insightful and convincing interpretation, and we want to think about authors' choices.
Yeah, and of course that takes us to criterion C, which is organization and focus. You definitely want to use the language of the guiding question. In this case, we're looking at atmosphere and tension, and we want to keep that focus and keep our mind on that for the entire writing process.
That's great. And criteria D is the language and the writing. We want to have precise and elevated vocabulary, complex sentences, and a little bit of voice and personality to our writing would be really, really nice.
Okay, Mr. Giles. Now, going back to that last passage, we had a guiding question, and our guiding question asked us, by what techniques has the author built up the atmosphere and tension in the passage? And we used that question, Mr. Giles, to arrive at a thesis. Could you take us through the thesis that we arrived at in our last video?
Yeah, the thesis reads, the tense and fearful atmosphere and the uncertainty of the future of a lost cat helps to parallel the dissonance and instability in the relationship between Ruth and Oliver. It's almost as if the future of their relationship depends on finding the cat.
Yeah, and again, we talked about this in our last video. We talked about how we like the two sentences, how we think the student is going after larger implications and subtleties of the text, and we feel pretty good about that. Now, the next phase would be to create a rudimentary outline. Mr. Giles, take us through this short rudimentary outline that the student has created.
Yeah, so this student is deciding to write 6 body paragraphs, and again, that's ambitious, but it's going to first think about Oliver's perspective and what Oliver's thinking and what he does. Then the next body paragraph is going to look at Ruth and how her perspective. There's going to be a paragraph dedicated to weather and setting. That's very smart because that's all about the atmosphere. And again, we have the next paragraph, Ruth's internal dialogue. We have the crow as a paragraph all by its own, which makes us happy. We like the crow in this passage. And then we have the ending and the final tone. So we see that the structure of the passage is helping to guide this student, and I think that's wise.
Now, students, keep in mind this may look like a lot, but obviously these aren't going to be massive bricks of paragraphs. These are going to be controlled, focused paragraphs that will allow the student to produce that quantity of writing within the allotted time. All right, Giles, what do you say we get into the text? A quick reminder of our highlighting protocol here. We're using blue for textual references. We're using yellow for the literary features. We're using orange for the author-audience relationship, and we're going to be using this green color to link into the key language of the question.
Yeah, that's right. The guiding question is important, so you'll see the green is, again, and we also see some connections to the thesis as well. Okay, so let's look at the introduction first. And what is something you notice about the introduction that you like?
Well, Mr. Giles, it's very clear to me. Just the recognition of the green shows me the immediate focus. The writer has immediately brought in the key terms of the guiding question, and they've leveraged that through this idea of atmosphere and setting to arrive at the thesis. And they're not talking about the text. Ruth Ozeki, the author's name, is highlighted there. They're going to talk about how she uses the text to push her message. So I think the student's off to a great start.
I agree, and I think there's also even a reference to the setting. We also see that the student shows a real command of what's happening in the passage. It's a really concise summary of what's happening in the passage. This is, again, I think a really wise thing to do in an introduction, and you, of course, end with a really powerful thesis that is making that really great impression.
All right, Giles, we get to that first body paragraph, and if I quickly scroll and look, this paragraph is well lit. There's some good stuff happening in here. Take us away.
Yeah, topic sentence is establishing right away the topic about Oliver's perspective and what Oliver does. And again, it's using the language of the guiding question, talking about the tense atmosphere. Really wise. We see blue are the textual references where we know that we're making some reference to those things.
Yeah, and then as we move further down, again, the next paragraph begins with the reader begins, and again, that's that focus on the author-audience relationship. This is about the author and the reader and how they're communicating. So we see that. And then this is some really good focus on the internal voice and the conflict. I think you want to pick up these really important plot points. And of course, the conflict is essential to any passage you're discussing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. And I like how concise the paragraph is, but again, it's connecting to the idea of tension, which is what the tension is really central to the guiding question, and it's central to the passage. The third body paragraph is, I think, a powerful one. It's one that we talked about in the previous video. It's really thinking carefully about that weather and the setting and that idea of pathetic fallacy, that it's almost conveying an emotion all by itself. And I think that's really well established in the beginning of that big body paragraph.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and finish that off and talk about some of the amazing features that the student is showcasing here.
Yeah, it's again tapping into that internal dialogue where she's wondering what's happening. Again, we see the imagery of the trees and how the trees almost have feelings of their own. They're almost personified. And again, this almost some speculation about what's foreshadowed, what's happening to the relationship itself and how that relates to Ruth's own fear. So I think that again shows like insight and perception. We see the student really doing some deep thinking about what's happening to these characters and how they're feeling.
Yeah, I think the next two paragraphs I'd like to take in tandem, Mr. Giles, because
Sure.
I think they build off one another. I think through the use of dialogue, Ozeki really shows the confusion and the fear in the reader, the use of the rhetorical question, the uncertainty, the trepidation they feel in this hostile environment. That she's just had an argument with her partner, the cat is gone, and I think she's very distraught, and this leads her to seek answers. And then the next paragraph, she's going to interact with the crow. And I think this is a very unusual thing, obviously. I'm not usually talking to birds, I don't know about you, but I just feel like, this really deserves its own special attention to talk about the symbolic weight of the crow, perhaps talk about the anthropomorphism, and talk about how her uncertainty and trepidation has led her to really seek answers in an unusual place.
Yeah, I like that. I think that was a good decision, right, to sort of emphasize that. And then the final body paragraph is looking at the ending of the passage and the sort of tone that the passage brings out. And again, just sort of the imagery of Oliver coming out of the forest without the cat, and how important that was, and how that really almost... Now the tension is still quite bleak, but that they realize that Pesto's gone, and that sad realization is how the writer sort of ends that body paragraph.
Yeah, but I think it's really critical in the conclusion to talk about, the thesis talked about how losing Pesto sort of parallels and mirrors this notion that perhaps the relationship is in trouble as well. And I think the writer's done a really nice job to come back to that idea of parallel, the lack of harmony between the characters, the lack of harmony with nature during the storm, and to just really show that, this resolution is left unclear, and we don't really have a clear resolution or close of the passage. I think the characters all remain in despair or distraught, and I actually like to read this book now.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. It's a fantastic book. I would say, just in closing, we want to think about this piece of writing. I think shows really convincing interpretation, and it shows a lot of insight into the characters, how they're feeling, and I think there's an argument about that relationship that's really driving this entire paper.
Yes.
I really like that.
Yeah, staying in criterion A, there's a wide use of textual references. Looking at the paper lit up, I see an immense amount of yellow, which shows that they've really thought about the style of the writer. We've really thought about our characters. This author-audience relationship is present. There's amazing focus, which of course is important for criterion C. And Mr. Giles, the language is elevated throughout. There's a good range of sentence structures. Accuracy is high. Vocabulary is elevated. I think we're looking at a very, very strong paper here.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the focus is very strong, and again, this is for the new course, and this is again addressing that guiding question in a lot of detail.
Yeah, students. Lastly, please notice that this is not an old style commentary from the old course.
No.
This is all focused on atmosphere and tension, and we're bringing in other features to supplement our discussion on atmosphere and tension. We've taken the guiding question, we've utilized it, and we brought in other ideas to help support our ideas with respect to the guiding question.
That's right. So again, the entire piece of writing is there for you to look at in more detail, because I know we went through this kind of quickly. So have a look at that. You'll see it all lit up for you to look at, and think about how you can apply SCASNI and arrive at a good thesis, and then take a lot of those ideas and put it into a really powerful, interesting interpretation of the prose fiction passage that you're writing about.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Giles. Students, we hope you enjoyed this, and we'll catch you next time, and have a great day.
Thanks, guys.